Buenas noches a todos. Les damos la bienvenida al ciclo de charlas de la AAPG UBA Student Chapter. Good evening, everyone. We are pleased to welcome you to the AAPG UBA Student Chapter Talk Series. This lecture is being live streaming on our YouTube channel. We ask you to leave your comments and questions on the live chat. We will read them at the end of the talk. Tonight we present a topic of great interest to the energy industry, one of the most promising processes to mitigate the effects of climate change, carbon capture and storage, or CCS. To talk about this, we have the honor to present the renowned Professor John Kaldi. John Kaldi is an emeritus professor of petroleum geology and engineer at the Australian School of Petroleum and Energy Resources from the University of Adelaide. Is a CO2 distinguished scientist and holds the South Australia State Chair in CCS. Professor Kaldi received a PhD in geology from Cambridge University. His career includes 18 years in the petroleum industry in both technical and managerial roles. John Kaldi served as distinguished lecturer for important organizations, including Society of Petroleum Engineers, AAPG, and the Petroleum Exploration Association of Australia. He has been the author and presenter of over 150 journal articles and technical conference papers. It's a pleasure to welcome Professor John Kaldi.
Thank you. Muchas gracias, Angela.
Thank you.
So, buenas noches, everybody. And that will end the sum total of my Spanish for this evening's talk. I'm really, really pleased to be able to join you for this evening, because I think it's a really important topic that we're going to discuss. I will, at the end of the talk, I will be happy to stay on and have discussion, answer questions with whoever would like to stay on. Anyway, why don't we start now? I'd like to talk to you about the big issues, the opportunities towards achieving a sustainable energy future through carbon capture and storage. This is a composite nighttime photograph from a satellite imagery, and it's taken in the year 2012, as you can see here. And what you're seeing here are the points of light. What do those points of light mean? Well, that's where energy is being used to light the lights, to run the generators, the air conditioners, the heat, etc. So I'm here right now. That little dot of light, that's Adelaide. And I see that most of you are somewhere in here. There's Argentina, Buenos Aires, Brazil, etc. Well, one of the things that is very obvious is that the main energy use certainly is in Europe, in North America, Japan, China, obviously India, and a few other places. So usually I just ask for input, but we're not going to be able to do that on this Zoom, as to what you would think would look like if we did another satellite imagery in the year 2030. And of course, most of you would tell me, well, there would be more lights, John. Yeah, there'd be probably more lights in here, more lights in here, probably more lights there, up there, probably in Russia, Mongolia, etc. Yeah, so the energy demand in 2030 will increase over to the energy demand that we had in 2012 or that we have today. So let's see where this energy consumption, this demand is met. Well, the scale here is in millions of tons of oil equivalent. And this is dated from the IEA in 2019, comparing in blue 2009 and in orange color their projections for 2035. So as you can see, the International Energy Agency's projections are that fossil fuels are going to remain very, very important. Yes, we'll have more nuclear, we'll probably have more hydro, more biomass, and we'll get renewables. But look at the scale that is predicted. And where's that energy consumption going to be used? This is by region. Is North America, oil is black, gas is red, coal is blue, green is renewables. So the majority of our energy consumption is likely to continue to be in the Asia Pacific, North America, Europe, South and Central America, very limited in the main equivalent of oils, of millions of tons of oil. So, this is the main kicker that we are looking at. And of course, in the future, there's going to be more in the Asia Pacific, more in the Middle East and Africa, and probably more in South and Central America, your regions. Even the best predictions, though, are showing very, very limited input from renewables. So let's take a look at that. Here's a plot from the AAPG. Now, this goes back a few years, but things haven't changed very much. Now this scale is in billions of barrels of oil equivalent per year. And in yellow, the yellow line is the projected world energy demand. And this comes from about 1900 down to 2100, so the end of this century. And as you could see, certainly in this part of the graph, we're looking at predominantly fossil fuels, coal, natural gas liquids, and oil. Even at the end of the century, the best predictions we can make is that at least half of our energy demand will be met still by fossil fuels. Yes, we will have more of the renewables, solar, wind, geothermal, hydrogen, hopefully more nuclear, but most of our energy demands will, at least 50%, will still require fossil fuels. And unfortunately, folks, that is a reality. We're not going to get away from fossil fuels just because we would like to. What does that mean? Well, it means that the product from burning fossil fuels is greenhouse gas generation. So certainly a large part, certainly going into 2060, maybe even further, a large percentage of the greenhouse gas emissions are going to be caused by the burning of fossil fuels. And like I say, unfortunately, we cannot just say stop with the fossil fuels unless everybody wants to turn off their lights, turn off their heat and air conditioning, and mainly your petrochemicals. Well, I don't have to tell you guys what we all use fossil fuels for. Okay, so this greenhouse gas generation remains significant. We're going to continue using the fossil fuels. What can we do about it? Well, there's another cost of energy, And that, of course, is the effect on the climate system. I'm not going to bore you by showing you all the pictures of the melting icebergs and glaciers. You've seen all of that. There are many, many reports. I think the jury on whether anthropogenic CO2 causes climate change, I think the jury is out. I think most people, except the die-hard skeptics, are all of agreement that yes, anthropogenic CO2 does have a direct effect on the climate system, global warming, climate change. So I don't want to talk any more about that. I think we're all, pretty much aware of that. What causes the increase in greenhouse gases? Well, we all know this, fossil fuel burning, and that's driven by those energy demands that I mentioned. But of course, there's also the change in land use, and those of you, especially in Brazil, understand this, converting your forests to farms and industry. As we're getting a population increase, we have to feed the population, so we have increased agriculture, more livestock, and certainly in Asia, more rice growing. As we get an increase in population, we have increased requirements for that population growth, which is industry, iron, steel, cement, and manufacturing. All of this comes at a price, and that price, of course, is the increase in greenhouse gas. So energy is the primary, but not the only contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So let's say that the energy sector is responsible for 35%, the agriculture, forests to other land use is 25%, industry 20%, transport 14%, and building, of course, 6% or so. Okay, so this is the reason that we're getting the greenhouse gas emissions. Well, let's focus now specifically on electricity generation. And I'm going to show you a little plot here that shows us tons of CO2 required for each megawatt hour of electricity generated. Now remember, 1 ton of CO2 is approximately 556 cubic meters, or in the oil field terminology, about 20,000 cubic feet of CO2 for each ton. So let's see what happens when we generate our electricity using different fuels. If we're burning brown coal, we're generating 1.2 tons for every megawatt hour of electricity that is produced. If we burn black coal, that's 0.8 tons of CO2 for each megawatt hour. And if we burn gas, methane, it's 0.4 tons of CO2 for each megawatt hour. So an obvious abatement or reduction in our emissions would be to convert our coal-fired electricity generators to gas. Well, that's an easy concept, but obviously there's a lot of infrastructure already built around the world for burning coal. And the investors who have spent the investment dollars for building these generators are going to be reluctant to just try to switch it over to gas. Although that is happening, it is happening slowly. It's happening predominantly in the US, actually. And they're converting the black coal and brown coal fired electricity power plants to gas, you know how they're doing it? By fracking. So maybe fracking isn't such a bad thing. Anyway, off that subject now. So where are the global CO2 emissions coming from? Well, first of all, back in 2019, a couple of years ago, the world generated 36 gigatons, that's 36 billion tons of anthropogenic CO2. Where did it come from? Well, most of it came from China, the United States, India, some Russia. So here's me, Australia, and I picked up a couple of the Central and South American countries, Mexico, Brazil. So we are all members of the 1% club, as are Italy, Turkey, Poland, France, UK, South Africa, Indonesia. So we are small players compared to the bigger boys and girls here, especially China and the US. So 36 gigatons. Well, the prediction is that these emissions are predicted to increase by 50% by 2030. 2030 is only 9 years from now. And where's that going to come from? Well, the main growth are going to be from the developing countries, China, India, which I will refer to as Chindia. Okay, so 50% increase. So if I'm a geologist, so my math isn't very good, but if we look at that 36 gigatons and increase it by 50%, add 18, so that'll be 54 gigatons by 2030. Well, what does that do? So obviously the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere are increasing. The data shows us that the latest reading back in May of 2019, we're now over 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. Well, what does that all mean? Well, I think most of us have spoken to our friends, our families, our non-scientific colleagues, and we realize that public opinion is out there. It says that climate change and global warming is real. I think most people are of that belief. They also believe that it's happening now. You know, the whole idea of geological time is far too abstract for most people who aren't geologists. A year or two is probably as long as they can think of, rather than the millions of years that we think of. They believe that the climate change, global warming, is caused by greenhouse gas emissions. They do believe that greenhouse gas emissions are from anthropogenic, man-made activities. And they think that the fossil fuel industry is the main contributor. We are the bad guys in this game. Most people believe that something should be done. Something must be done to abate these emissions. And we're seeing it all over the place now. The shareholders of the big companies, Shell, BP, ExxonMobil, are demanding that their companies, oil and gas companies, decrease their emissions. Well, our lawmakers, our politicians are responsive to public sentiments. Why? Because public sentiment equals votes. Our big lenders, this is the World Bank, the Asia Development Bank, the International Monetary Fund, all of the big banks that lend money for major projects are under a lot of pressure to only fund clean energy projects. So industry is positioning itself for a carbon-constrained world. And I'm not talking about only the oil and gas or coal industry. I'm talking about every industry you can imagine. Transportation, aluminium, steel, cement, all of these, of course, the power industry is readying itself to live, hopefully survive, in a carbon-constrained world. But the question is, how are we going to do it, and what's it going to cost? Well, let's take a look at some of the energy-related CO2 emissions and how we might be able to cut them. Okay, so this is the gigatons of CO2 emitted. This is per annum. Okay, here we are today. And like I said, we're putting out, about 36 or so, maybe a little bit more gigatons of CO2 per annum. If we take a business as usual scenario, we will go up this trajectory to about there, so that in 2050, we will be somewhere in this 54, 55 gigatons per annum emission scenario. And that is what we call the 6DS, or a 6 degrees centigrade increase in if we go BAU, which stands for business as usual. So that's the trajectory we are on if we do nothing. The Paris Agreement in 2015 said that we are hoping for only a 2 degree scenario, which is a 2 degree centigrade increase in temperature, which will get us down to here. How do we go from here to here? Well, we have to employ a whole range of technologies. I'll call that our portfolio approach. And it will require renewables, which will take care of about 30%. Carbon capture and storage, about 13%. Power generation, efficiency, switching from coal to gas, end-use fuel and electricity efficiency, and nuclear. So all of these things are going to be required. Which is the best one? Well, they're all good. Which is the one we should go for? Well, if we're serious about decreasing the emissions, we don't have a magic single answer, no silver bullet. We have to incorporate all of these technologies, plus personal reductions in our own emissions through garbage, recycling, etc. We have to use all of these if we're serious about decreasing it. So the one I want to talk to you about today, of course, is carbon capture and storage. And I want to go through the carbon capture and storage value chain. So we can produce, or we produce CO2 in many different ways. We produce them at power stations, whether they're gas-fired or coal-fired. We can produce them at cement plants, gas processing, aluminium smelters, iron and steel mills. All of these different industries produce CO2. What we need to do for CCS is somehow capture the CO2 and separate it from the other byproducts that are generated in a flue gas, compress that CO2, transport it, and inject it into the subsurface for permanent CO2 storage. Let's take these one by one. First of all, capture and separation. Capture and separation are really the domain of our chemical engineering colleagues. They've been working on capture and separation mechanisms for about 20 or 30 years now. Yet still, it is the most expensive of our varied components along our CCS value chain. It's also the one that is getting probably the greatest amount of attention because of the high cost. What are some of the capture technologies that are in use today? Well, one of my students drew this. They said, oh, you want to capture the CO2? Does that mean capture it and put it in jail? Well, not exactly put it in jail, but put it somewhere where we can actually transport it and put it into permanent storage underground. So the main capture technologies that are in use today are gas processing, and this is taking place and has taken place for about 50 years or so. When we produce a gas, methane, for sales gas, very often there's a certain component, anywhere between 5 and 60% CO2, and we separate that in order to get our sales gas. Then we've got post-combustion capture, pre-combustion capture, and oxy fuel combustion. So I'll briefly touch upon all of these. So our natural gas processing capture relies on the combination of natural gas, methane, plus carbon dioxide as a contaminant, being separated using what's called an amine solvent. The two gases that are mixed go into the solvent, and the solvent is heated up, and at a certain temperature, the carbon dioxide comes off, and then the remaining material is our methane, which is sold as sales gas, and that's what we use for our heating and cooking and our fertilizers. Then we've got post-combustion capture, and post-combustion capture refers to taking that CO2 from the flue gas after the fuel has been burnt or combusted in air. So we start with a fuel. It could be coal, it could be gas, it could be wood, almost anything, biofuels, and we burn it in air. That combustion boils water. That water then produces steam. The steam turns a turbine. The turbine gives us power, and the burnt material results in carbon dioxide and other gases, predominantly nitrogen. So the important thing is to separate out that carbon dioxide from the other gases. And at the moment, most people are using that same amine solvent that the gas industry has been using. Then there's what we call pre-combustion capture. This refers to a process where we generate a synfuel, where the hydrocarbon, the fuel that we use, gas or coal, is turned into a gas, and there's what's called the water gas shift reaction, and that forms a mixture of hydrogen and CO2. And then the hydrogen is what's burnt. This is where it leads to what we are all talking about these days, called the hydrogen economy. Because once you've got this separation, you can then take that hydrogen and combust the hydrogen, and the only exhaust gases when you combust hydrogen is basically water vapor. So again, you turn the turbine, you generate your power, and you've made the carbon dioxide come off pre-combustion. Okay, so it's a fairly robust technique. there are not any commercial pre-combustion power plants at the moment. There are demonstration, small-scale, desktop, benchtop units, but we don't have any of these to scale at yet. The last one I want to talk about, and there are several of these working in the world, is Oxy Fuel Capture. So basically, this involves a conventional power station where the boilers burn a pulverized coal, but they burn it in a pure oxygen environment, and that fuels the steam generator, creates the exhaust mixture with a highly concentrated CO2 as well as water vapor. Because your CO2 is highly concentrated, it's easier and cheaper to separate and to then capture and put into a truck or pipeline. So how mature are these technologies? Well, gas processing, it's got wide commercial uptake. Post-combustion, we have a few commercial projects and several demonstrations. Pre-combustion, only experimental with a few demo projects. Oxy-fuel combustion, several demonstration, again, mainly experimental. So we've got a long way to go in the capture side. Okay, let's take a look at the next bit. This is the compression and transport. And this is the best understood. Why is this the best understood? Well, because we have been compressing gases, not only CO2, but methane, hydrogen, all sorts of gases for about 100 years or so. Okay, so we know how to compress them. We know how to transport because we've been transporting supercritical. I'll talk about supercritical in a few minutes. We've been transporting CO2 for over 50 years. Okay, how do we transport it? Well, we can transport by ship, we can transport by road, we can transport by rail, or we can transport by pipeline. And chances are that the most likely method onshore will probably be via pipeline. What is the cost of transport? For short distances, pipelines are cheaper than the shipping. For long distances, shipping is the most economical choice. Is it safe? Do we know what we're doing? Well, at the moment, we've already got more than 2,500 kilometers of supercritical, and like I said, I'll talk about what supercritical means shortly, but we've got more than 2,500 kilometers of supercritical CO2 pipelines in the USA and a little bit in Canada. So transport of CO2 is well-established technology. Why are we transporting CO2? Well, mainly for enhanced oil recovery. Okay, let's now talk about the last bit, which is really what many geologists and reservoir engineers are more concerned with, and that's the injection and the subsurface storage of CO2. Okay, well, as most of us know who deal with the subsurface, anytime you're talking about the subsurface, especially thousands of meters below the surface, we're dealing with a lot of uncertainty. More uncertainty than in any of these other components of our value chain. This is where our geoscience and reservoir engineering skills really come into play. How do we reduce that uncertainty? Well, reducing that uncertainty requires exploration, site-specific studies that include things like reservoir characterization, geochemistry, geomechanics, modeling, monitoring, economics, and risk analysis. And you probably realize that these are all very, very familiar topics because we do these all the time in the petroleum industry. So these technologies are now being developed for CCS through various demonstration projects. In other words, learning by doing. So what are the key criteria for selecting a site for storage of CO2? There's three main ones. Injectivity. Can we actually put the CO2 into the rock? Capacity. What volume? How much CO2 can the rock hold? And containment. Can that CO2 actually remain in the rock safely, not leak out? Well, there's another one in there, which is what I call other, which is important because we have to monitor, we have to work the economics, we need to understand the regulatory framework, the risk, and the social acceptance, the social license to operate for CCS. So for geological storage of CO2, what do we need? And here's an outcrop along the Otway shoreline in Victoria, Australia. And, it's to demonstrate the components necessary for storage. Now, you got to understand, I give a lot of talks to the general public. I show this slide, and they immediately raise their hand. Are you going to put it into the cliffs, but the CO2 is going to leak out? And I have to explain to them, and all geologists know that this is only an outcrop, and we're doing these same sorts of rocks in the deep subsurface where they cannot get out. Anyway, you guys know that. So what do we need? Well, we need a reservoir rock, probably a sandstone, something porous. We need a seal rock, non-porous, porous, non-permeable, such as a claystone or shale. We need it to be at a certain depth for the CO2 to remain supercritical. I'll address that in a few minutes. So let's take a look. So there's our sandstone reservoir rock, there's our claystone or shale seal rock. And if we take a look at our reservoir rock, let's do that very quickly, what we see right away is that if we look at the rock with a CT scanner, and we're just going to slice through that core plug, and then we're going to rebuild that core plug, but now the CT scanner is highlighting the pore space. So this is the pore volume of CO that will hold CO2, or of course, any gas or oil in the subsurface. So it's that red stuff that is our storage space, and we can measure the volume. We can treat these CT scanning images just like we do 3D seismic. We can take slices, we can take horizontal, vertical sections, we could do some calculations of the volumetrics, etc. So that's where we put our CO2. Okay, so storage effectiveness increases the deeper we go in the subsurface. So you've got to use your imagination. Let's imagine we have a balloon and we fill that balloon with 100 volumes of CO2. It could be 100 cubic centimeters, 100 cubic meters, whatever unit you want to use. Let's just say that balloon is filled with 100 units. Okay, if we compress this to what we call a supercritical state, we go down to here, and at this critical depth and critical pressure, we can compress it into what we call a supercritical fluid. Once it gets to that stage, and that volume, which used to be 100, is now reduced to less than 0.4. So it's about 0.3. So it's about a 400-fold decrease in volume. Now, we're very lucky because Mother Nature is kind, because at approximately 1 kilometer, 1,000 meters, that supercritical CO2 will remain in that supercritical state. Now, I give a lot of talks, as I mentioned, to the general public, okay? And they don't understand supercritical, so I define that for them. I say supercritical CO2 means it's got a gas-like viscosity with a liquid-like density. But still, I see that people are very, very worried because, you know, if you say supercritical, people think, well, critical is dangerous. Supercritical must be super dangerous. So I take away supercritical and replace that with what I call dense phase CO2. And that's probably a good way to refer to it. Okay, so now let's talk about how we can actually trap that CO2. Okay, this is a pretty dated slide, but I'm going to use it anyway. It's from 2005, and it shows the different contributions, percentage trapping contributions by different trapping mechanisms. So we've got our structural, stratigraphic, and hydrodynamic trapping, which takes up the majority of it. Certainly at the early stages since the start and stopping of injection. Okay, then as we go further down in time, we can look at residual trapping, solubility trapping, and finally, mineral trapping. Okay, and as you go further from the left to the right, obviously you have increasing storage security with each of these systems. So let's take a look at those. Okay, first of all, the structural, stratigraphic, and hydrodynamic trapping, which I'll call the SST. This is what we call the most familiar, best understood, hence the lowest risk trapping. And you're all familiar with that because that means putting it into an anticline trap or a fault trap or underneath an unconformity or into a pinch out in stratigraphic traps. So, you know, we're as geoscientists and reservoir engineers, we're fairly familiar with dealing with these geological features. Okay, so let me show you a little scenario. This is hypothetical of what happens if we put CO2 in a depleted reservoir that's structurally trapped. So initially, first of all, remember that we're looking at something that's thousands of meters below the surface, okay? And we've got a reservoir unit folded into an anticline. There's two traps here. This one above, the top one is filled with gas, lower one filled with oil. Okay, so we drill our wells, produce this field, okay, deplete the oil, deplete the gas, but don't forget that even when we deplete, we're left with residual gas or residual oil occupying some of that pore volume in the reservoir, okay? Well, now we want to convert that depleted field into a CO2 injection. So we start injecting into that trap, and well, we're certainly not going to fill up all of the pore volume because we've got some of that pore volume filled with residual gas or residual oil. Plus, don't forget, we will also always have a residual or a residual water saturation, okay? SWIRR, or irreducible water saturation, which means that that pore space filled with the irreducible water cannot take the CO2. Okay, so storage capacity is controlled by rock properties, not just porosity. We've got two rocks. These are thin section photographs. Rock A's got 28.4% porosity. Rock B's got 28.4% porosity. Rock A's got almost 1,400 millidarcy perm. Rock B, 0.22. So now we're going to talk about how that irreducible water saturation becomes a critical control on how much storage we can have. So we've got here plotted on the bottom the wetting phase of water saturation, and on the vertical axis, injection pressure. Now, don't forget that when we want to inject CO2, we have to keep the pressure which we're injecting below the pressure that would frack or fracture the rock. In other words, below the frac pressure. Okay, so rock A, the one that's got the high permeability, will look like this. Okay, so you're going to have an irreducible water saturation of 7%. With an irreducible water saturation of 7%, that means that the effective porosity is 93%, or 0.93. We multiply that by the porosity, and we get a volume of 26.4% that is effective for storage. We take a look at the other rock with exactly the same pore volume, but a lower permeability. Okay, there's the curve on that. Here we've got an irreducible water saturation of 82%. So our effective porosity is 0.18, the difference between 100 and 82, 0.18 times 28.4. So that's only 5.1. So we've got two rocks, same porosity, but very, very different storage capacity and efficiency. Okay, so those are the issues we deal with in our structural, stratigraphic, and hydrodynamic trapping. Let's now take a look at some of the other types of trapping. These are the ones associated with migration of that CO2. Once we inject that CO2 because of buoyancy, that CO2 will tend to migrate. Okay, let's see what happens during that MAT, or migration-associated trapping. Well, first of all, we don't always have the luxury of having depleted fields, or for that matter, we don't always have the luxury of having anticlines and stratigraphic traps. Sometimes we're looking at deep saline aquifers as CO2 targets. What happens when we put the CO2 into that system? Well, that's where our migration-associated trapping comes in. We can have CO2 that's trapped in solution, CO2 trapped as a mineral, or CO2 trapped in the rock pores as residual saturation, or residual gas, where the gas is CO2. Let's first take a look at the dissolution of our injected CO2 over time. We're looking at a homogeneous reservoir, flat-lying seal above, and a cross-section. So we'll start injecting our CO2. Okay, there goes the CO2. Because of buoyancy, it rises to the top. Because it's got a seal above it, it gets flattened out. 5 years, 30 years, 40, 330 years. Look what happens after about 1,000 years. A lot of that CO2 is now dissolved into the formation brine. That formation brine then gets denser, and you've got downward fingering of that CO2 because now it's denser than the mother fluid in the rock. That's permanent trapping. The next one, I think you're all familiar with. I'm sure we've all been in limestone caves. You know what those limestone caves are? And when you look at a thin section and see the calcite between the grains there, all that calcite, all that lovely calcite stalactites and stalagmites, that's Mother Nature storing CO2 as calcium carbonate. And the last one I want to talk about is the CO2 that's trapped in the pores as residual gas saturation, residual CO2 gas saturation. Okay, what this means is that if we've got the grains here and we've injected the CO2, that CO2 is wanting to migrate upwards, and sometimes it leaves behind a residual CO2 due to the snap off of the CO2 from the host CO2. So let me just show you a little visualization of what I mean here. Okay, imagine this is a water-filled pore, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to inject the CO2 into this formation, and we're going to look at it on the pore scale. So let's take a look at what happens. Okay, so there's the CO2 going in. Okay, whoops, there's the CO2 going in. Okay, and you can see that as you go in and you finally go through this series, you get what's called snap off. I'll just run through it again. Okay, CO2 enters the pore. Okay, and then you get snap off, and there's our residual or our trapped CO2. Okay, the next thing I want to touch upon is injectivity. Injectivity is really a measure of volume over time. How much can you put in over what period of time? And we call that a rate. So that injection rate, you know, the volume over time, is a function of three things. The A, which is the area of the wellbore that's in contact with the formation. Pi, the injection pressure, as long as we keep it below the frac pressure. And K, the permeability. So the injectivity or the injection rate is proportional to the number and orientation of wells. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that the rock permeability, K, is a constant. We know that the injection pressure is finite, so the only variable that we can control is A, the area of the wellbore in contact with the formation. How do we control the volume of the wellbore? Well, we could double the volume by drilling a second well. We could increase the volume by drilling horizontal wells. So the number and orientation of wells. However, the more wells we drill, the more horizontal the well is, the greater the cost. The other things we have to consider is that the pore spaces in the subsurface are already full. And when we inject CO2, it causes the reservoir pressure to build up. If we have depleted oil and gas fields, this pressure buildup could be neutral, or for that matter, it could even be beneficial. But in both our depleted fields and our saline formations, we must maintain pressure below the frac pressure. If we have low permeability reservoirs, this may mean that we have to limit our storage capacity because we will require lower injection rate, requiring more wells or horizontals to meet our injection needs. The other thing, of course, injection in saline formations may displace saline fluids and increase the risk of possible mixing with freshwater systems. Chevron here in Australia has come up with a technology whereby they will drill pressure relief wells. They'll produce water to make that pressure in the subsurface lower, allowing more CO2 injection. Okay, let me just go through a few other things now that have that are less technical. What are the most common objections that we find about CCS? Most people will say the cost. Some will say that there's not enough storage capacity in the world, that we don't have the right regulations or liability. Public acceptance is an issue because some people think it's only a trick or a ploy to keep coal and fossil fuels going. And some people say, oh, no, CCS is unproven technology. Well, let's take a look at cost first. And this is levelized cost of electricity generation. This is taken from 2016, and the different components of it and the different types of energy. So let's take a look. The first one, which is pulverized coal burnt in a generator to produce electricity. And this is in dollars per megawatt hour. So if we have pulverized coal, no CCS, basically business as usual, in 2016, we're paying about $50 per megawatt hour. Okay? If we look at coal with CCS, we've more than doubled it, about $100 or $110 per megawatt hour. Okay? If we're using gas, well, a little bit of savings, but still about double the cost. So people are very unhappy with that cost. So, well, why don't we look at some of these other ones? So here's geothermal, here's nuclear, this is biomass. And as you can see, they're not very different from our coal or gas with CCS. Well, most people say, no, we don't want that stuff. We want solar. We want wind. Okay, let's look at those. Here's solar photovoltaic, here's solar thermal, and solar wind, and wind offshore. So the costs, are pretty comparable to some technologies, but certainly still considerably lower than some of these other technologies. Yes, prices are coming down, but I want you to keep this in mind. Prices are coming down. The photovoltaics between 2016 to 2050 are probably going to come down by 75%. Thermal is going to come down 60%, wave, wind, etc. But CCS is also going to come down by about 35%. That's just because an increase in volume means decrease in price. Okay, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change concluded that worldwide there's technical potential about 2,000 billion tons of CO2. Okay, that's about 200 years of storage capacity at the current rates of emissions. Remember, that's 36 gigatons. Okay, one of the things we have to worry about is what distance we have to transport it is that capacity. Public acceptance. So tell me, is reducing CO2 emissions a priority compared to other social and environmental issues? Should we focus on that? Should we focus on peace in the Middle East? Should we focus on COVID? What is the biggest pressing issue for the public? Okay, is CCS just a clever ploy of the fossil fuels industry? There's a very, very strong influence of the activist minorities. You've seen them. Extinction Rebellion is just one, Greenpeace is another, and they have a very, very strong anti-fossil fuel lobby, and they view CO2, carbon capture and storage, as mainly a way to continue fossil fuels. Okay, what about the oil and coal companies? Well, the oil and coal companies are looking at their bottom line and they're listening to their shareholder power, but they're also saying, okay, we will reduce our emissions, but we will go bankrupt and your pensions will be lost. So public acceptance changes around because people are saying, wait a minute, keep our pensions safe. We want our money to grow. Okay. There's also the NIMBY, not in my backyard, but for CO2, it's not under my backyard, or NUMBY factor. CCS may be okay, but not here, do it somewhere else. What's important is getting the regulations right and getting some clarity on liability issues and demonstrating that it works. And demonstrating that it works, here's a bunch of demonstration projects on just capture in the world today. Okay, similar, this is for storage. Okay, so there's a lot of these demonstration projects. Today, in Australia, there's a number of CCS projects. In the world, there are now 17 active commercial scale projects, about 20 in the next couple of years. And by commercial scale, that means these guys are putting more than 1 million tons per year into the subsurface. So it's happening. Lack of clarity on regulations, and this is really a political issue. I'm sure that doesn't matter what country you're in, whether you're in South America, Latin America, North America, Australia, or Europe. Ministers, your politicians, will generally accept proposals that contain the words simple, quick, popular, and cheap. Deploying CCS, unfortunately, will be complicated, lengthy, expensive, and controversial. Ministers, politicians will generally throw out proposals that contain the words complicated, lengthy, expensive, and controversial. A few final thoughts about the challenges and opportunities in this carbon-constrained world that we're facing. First of all, having a carbon-constrained world is an environmental necessity, and it is a socio-political reality. It will happen, okay? Can it also be a business opportunity? And for those of you that are just starting out in your careers, this is the important question. There is a carbon price. There will be emissions trading, not if, but when and how much. Carbon capture and storage has already been recognized as a clean development mechanism by the United Nations Forum on Climate Change. That means that countries that adopt CCS can receive money from the UN because it is now recognized as a clean development mechanism. Enhanced oil recovery, enhanced gas recovery, and enhanced coal bed methane and other carbon capture utilization, as well as storage options, exist. We do have many issues to consider. First of all, can we convert our carbon-constrained world into a resource industry-style business model? Today, the main business model for CO2 utilization is EOR, enhanced oil recovery. But can we get to a point where we can find pore space, sell that pore space, lobby for that pore space? Well, of course. It means explore for it, which means plays and prospects, permitting, acreage release, certify that we've got the reserves of pore space, unitizing between different companies, determining who owns what part, developing infrastructure, site stewardship. What are the regulatory regimes? What are the legal liability issues? And what kind of financing and what kind of incentives could we get? These are the key questions we have to ask. So what are the opportunities? What are the business models? Will all be handled by one integrated operator, i.e. the Chinese government? Or will it be more likely different providers along the value chain? And I think this is probably the more likely scenario. Okay, last slide, the conclusions in this one, for those of you that are considering your career futures. Remember that the global response to climate change, and we're seeing it, is going to include a whole range of different mitigation measures, which will include greater energy efficiency, more renewables, lower carbon fuels, fuel switching, and CCS. We don't have any one simple and single answer. We are going to continue to use fossil fuels. So we do need to do it in a cleaner and smarter way. And you know what? CCS is the best option we have today for doing this. If we are serious about commercial deployment of CCS, that infrastructure for CCS will foster an industry that's, believe it or not, equal in size or even larger than the present day oil and gas industry. Shocking as that might seem, that's what it means. Okay? It's these demonstration projects that we're seeing today and the few commercial scale projects that we're working on today are the things that provide confidence that CCS is technically feasible and that will accelerate its continued commercial deployment. CCS will require skills. What kind of skills? Skills in engineering, skills in geoscience, skills in economics, legal, regulatory areas. Therefore, CCS will offer broad career opportunities that haven't been here in the past. How? Well, you have to be prepared for this new technology. You have to understand the subsurface. You have to understand transportation. You have to understand geoscience, chemical engineering. You have to prepare yourself for this new technology. And for this, I wish you guys all the best of luck, and I invite you to join this tremendous new opportunity that we're seeing arising globally. So I'll say thank you and turn it over for questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Kaldi. It was an amazing talk. Very, very complete, very, very well explained. And now we're going to pass for questions. Para el público mirando, ahora vamos a responder preguntas. Now we're going to select questions from the chat. The first question comes, how much CO2 is present in the atmosphere? How much CO2 can we capture from the sources and the atmosphere? Which will be the CO2 capture rate in the best scenario possible?
Okay, so today there's about 415 parts per million in the atmosphere. Okay, commercially we have, I'll be generous, 20 commercial scale projects that are capturing and storing CO2 at 1 million tons or so. Okay, so 20 times 1 million, that's 20 million tons a year. But we're generating 36 billion tons a year. So we have a 1,000-fold increase required of our present CCS activities in order to meet our emission reduction neutrality. Obviously, CCS is not the only way. We've got to include renewables, we've got to include the efficiency, all of those, plus personal commitment to using less fuel, eat less meat. And those of you that in Argentina and Brazil, eating less meat is a difficult concept. Same in Australia, we love our steaks. But those are the kinds of personal sacrifices or personal changes we will have to make. Are we willing to do it? Well, the big issues, of course, are the power plants and how we can reduce the emissions from those.
Well, linked to that question, do you realistically believe that the Paris Agreement on climate change will meet their objectives in the 2050 scenario, or do you think it's not very possible?
Okay, this is a tricky question because I'm always optimistic, always optimistic, and I'm always full of hope that we will do that. Okay. However, you all see what's happening in the world. The emissions are not decreasing in a fast enough period. Everyone is pledging to decrease. Every country's made their pledges, but very few countries are actually doing that. So I remain optimistic, but I'm also a realist. It's not happening at the rate that is required for it to be happening.
Of course. Next question from Luana asks, which are the main risks in the CO2 storage in the underground scenario?
Probably the biggest risk, I assume that you mean for leakage, right? Yeah, okay. I think the biggest risk, and we are working on this, is probably through existing well bores that we haven't actually isolated and properly cemented in. That is probably the greatest risk. Our new wells that we drill, the new drilled wells, are pretty good because they are taken with all the precautions, all the stainless steel that's required to prevent corrosion, etc., and leakage. But old wells, I mean, there are 500,000 orphan wells. By orphan, I mean that people just don't know exactly where they are. 500,000 orphan wells in Texas alone. Okay, and some of these wells, you know, were drilled in the early part of the 20th century. They've been very poorly plugged. They've been literally abandoned. And if those wells are not found and properly completed, and we inject CO2 into those areas where they are, we are looking at a potential risk of the migration, unwanted migration. So I think that's the biggest risk. I don't think that other issues that people talk about are big risks. Induced seismicity, well, I think we have ways of controlling that. We have a lot of knowledge on geomechanics. We can control the rates at which we inject. We can control the orientation of our injection wells. We know the regional stress field directions, and we can manage those issues. So those aren't the big risks. I reckon the biggest risks are still going to be the orphan or the unknown locations of existing old wells. If we go to a place where there's never been any drilling, yeah, we remove that risk. But of course, it's previous drilling that gives us the information that we need about the subsurface. So if you go someplace where you've had lots of wells, you've got the benefit of better understanding the system and lowering your uncertainty there, but you increase your risk of the number of wells that might be poorly completed and be potential leak sites.
Perfect. Yeah, that would be the example of a mature oil field, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Next question, and I think it focuses on the profitableness of the CCUS, and it says, could we use CO2 as a secondary gas or oil recovery to reduce the cost of CCS?
Of course. And the only CCS projects today that are actually making money are the ones where the CO2 is used as a chemical flood for increasing the volume of oil that is produced. Okay, so that is the main reason that all those pipelines in the US and Canada are in existence. But you know, EOR is not being done anywhere else except North America and very, very, very few in China.
Okay.
People just have not adopted that technology outside. Now, you've got to be careful because not every oil field is amenable for enhanced oil recovery. You've got to be at a minimum miscibility pressure to allow the CO2 to become miscible with the oil. You need to have a certain residual oil saturation. Otherwise, it's not worth doing it if you've produced all of your or most of your oil on primary recovery mechanisms. You know, then there's no economic value. But the ones that are showing the technologies are the ones, you know, mainly in Texas, Oklahoma, a couple in Alberta and Saskatchewan, where EOR is turning fields that could be depleted into economic fields again. So yes, CO2 for EOR is the only way at present that people are making money from CCS.
Excellent. And linked to this last question, Professor Silvia Barredo asks, what about storage of CO2 in mafic rocks? Is it safe and profitable?
Well, the big issue you have, I assume she's asking about volcanics. Yes?
Yes, mafic, ultramafic.
Yeah, mafic volcanics. Look, there are parts of the world, especially India, where you've got the Deccan Trap, which is predominantly volcanic rocks. You've got the volcanic plateaus in Oregon and Washington State in the US. And they're doing demonstration projects. The big issue, of course, is the permeability, which translates directly to the injectivity. You might be able to get some in, but how much storage volume do you actually have? You know, because those vesicles, which are common as pore space in igneous, at least volcanic flows, those vesicles are usually not connected. So they may have the porosity, but they may not be connected up with the permeability. So it's a challenge to get that storage capacity and the injectivity into those. So, you know, 2 out of the 3 critical things, remember I talked about injectivity, capacity, and containment. 2 out of those 3 things are at high risk in those very mafic rocks.
Understandable. And the next question says, do you know if China has any regulation on the CO2 emissions? so we can meet our goals? That's
Okay, so there are laws now coming up that will limit the amount of CO2 that can be emitted. And Norway has a carbon tax. Okay? They will fine, I think it's about 40 euros per ton of CO2 that's emitted. Other countries have got various carbon taxes as well. People don't like the word tax, so they tend to use the word carbon penalty, but effectively it's a tax. California has one. Australia had one, but we got rid of it when we changed governments because nobody likes the word tax. So, you know, each country, this is where I talk about the big issues are the regulatory frameworks. You're not going to be able to get CCS going as a viable technology unless there's government regulatory support for it. Let's be very frank about that. Because economically, unless you're doing EOR, it just doesn't make sense. Companies are not going to be altruistic and do things just to save the planet. Because they have shareholders, as I showed you, shareholders want a return on their investment. And even though they want it clean and green, given a choice of having their investment returns or having it green, they'd prefer to go with their return on their investment. Human nature, I'm afraid. You know?
Yes.
I hope that helps answer that one.
The next question comes from Maisa, and it asks, what do you think of the CarbFix project? Is it a good option too? I am not aware of the CarbFix project.
Can ask him or her to help us. What is that project?
Okay. Have you listened? And since we're waiting, I'm gonna pass to the next one. What are the next steps in the research for the CCS technology?
Okay, the big one is to reduce the cost of capture. Find new solvents, find different membranes to capture and separate the CO2 that are less expensive than the present day amine solvent technology that we have, which is the main, and I won't say only, but it's the predominant commercial capture technology. So the big research, it's not a geological issue. A lot of the geological issues we have already had solutions to. It's very much the capture. Of course, you go beyond the technical issues of capture and storage, and you're left with those other pressing issues of regulatory framework. What standards are going to be used by the regulators? What incentives, financial incentives, will there be to push CCS over the next 20, 30, 40 years? You know, those are the real big issues that technically, you know, we're in a pretty good space for our storage. We understand pretty much the risks because it's all about the subsurface. And we've been working subsurface issues as geoscientists and engineers for a long time. It's those other ones like the capture technologies and of course, the other ones like the economics and the public perception and the legal liability regulatory issues that are the big issues.
Great. Returning to the CarbFix project question, Maisa answers, it's the one that detects CO2 in Iceland. But you have already answered it to Sylvia. Even the technology is different because they use CO2 dissolved in water.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, thank you.
There is a more pessimistic question here, and it says, won't CCS technologies be obsolete as the energy consumed rates grow, as population also is growing exponentially in the world?
Can you repeat that, Nuncio?
Yes, it's considering the world population is growing exponentially. Won't CCS
Yes.
technologies be obsolete as energy consumed rates would also increase, and CO2 emissions would also increase exponentially? So
Well,
it's like putting a
yeah, I think
in the big wound, some would say.
Okay, well, look, let's put it this way. CCS technology is just one technology that we can employ, and we will have to use a whole range, a whole portfolio of technologies if we are serious about reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. Now, we have an option as a population. We can do nothing. That's always an option. We can do nothing, and we can live with the consequences of climate change, global warming. We can adapt to those things. Humanity adapts. The question is, how much longer can we continue to adapt if we don't do something? And that's really the conclusions of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it's been the real consensus of the various Paris Accords. And the governments and industry are agreeing with that. But I will repeat that question that I posed in one of the earliest slides. What do we do to mitigate? How do we do it? And what's it going to cost? I mean, the easiest thing is business as usual. But then we have the risk of the consequences of climate change. Okay? Again, there are those people in the world, only a few of them left, fortunately, the Donald Trumps of the world, who just don't believe that CO2 emissions are causing climate change. But those are very few. Most people are now of the belief or of the opinion that these are things caused by our anthropogenic emissions. But are these issues and the costs associated with those, are those more important than, the peace in the Middle East, the COVID pandemics? Where should we put our efforts and our energy? What's more important? And, these are questions that, I cannot answer because it's an entire human race question that has to deal with that.
Yeah, it's understandable. It's a big issue, and it exceeds
very big,
I would say.
Very big.
We have two or three last questions.
Okay.
One from Muriel. She asks, what happens during the migration of CO2 in the subsurface? How does it interact with rocks and fluids as pressure and temperature increases? It's the supercritical.
Yeah, good question. And when you put CO2 into the supercritical phase, it's compressed, so it's about 400 times less volume, okay? But that concentrated CO2, when mixes with water, will still form a carbonic acid. So there are some clays and certainly carbonates that are susceptible to dissolution. If you dissolve in carbonate, okay, perhaps you're actually increasing the pore space, pore volume. So you're creating more pore volume by, naturally acidizing the formation, okay? As the CO2 migrates through buoyancy, what we need is to have a low permeability cap rock or seal. And the problems we might run into is if that seal is made out of carbonate, because then, yes, it might dissolve. But we have most of our seals that we consider good seals are shales. And those are generally not an issue, not a problem for dissolution from carbonic acid. As a matter of fact, even if we have a carbonate-rich seal, if we have our CO2 stored underneath a very thick seal, that migration, even though there's some dissolution, will take thousands of years. And as I showed you, in 1,000 years, most of that CO2 will dissolve in the water anyway. And because of the density change, will gravity finger downwards and be stored permanently. So I'm not all that concerned about the negative issues associated with CO2 migration through the subsurface. Like I said, my main risk to me is what happens in old or undiscovered or orphan wellbores.
Excellent. And the last question is here. How can we get a more effective EOR recovery with CO2, having in mind that gas is more mobile than water and oil?
So to repeat that question, I think I get it, but
yes.
Why not repeat just to make sure?
How can we get a more effective EOR recovery with CO2, having in mind that gas is more mobile than water in oil?
Yeah.
Or oil.
Okay. Good question. So we have to make sure that the CO2 and the oil that we're trying to increase the recovery from are miscible. So we have to get that's why I said not every oil reservoir is a good target for EOR. The oil and the CO2 have to be miscible. So that means that the properties of the oil need to be such that we can get a miscibility front. We can also need to make sure that we're at a pressure and temperature where the miscibility will actually happen. And then what we commonly do is we have a miscible oil front and we follow that up with a water injection. So we have what's called a WAG, water alternating gas, and the gas in this case being CO2. So that's the most efficient way that the companies that are doing EOR have found to do it. They find the right kind of oil to allow miscibility. They find the oil field that has a high enough residual saturation of oil to make it economically viable to put this expensive EOR project in there. And then they make sure that they have a way to recycle the CO2. Why? Believe it or not, we try to get rid of CO2, but if we want to use CO2 for an EOR project and we try to buy it, the cost of that CO2 is about 100 times greater than the cost of methane. So we're looking at, an economic issue that makes an EOR project, or the operators ask themselves very, very important economic questions about the properties of both the oil, the saturation, and the volumetrics that are in their oil and gas field, plus the transport distance that they will have to move that CO2 from its source to the actual operating field.
Perfect. And finally, a personal question that I would like you to answer it. What would you suggest an engineer, a petroleum engineer student, a geology student, it's transitioning its career, or a young professional, what would you suggest to them for study, or what areas should they develop in their careers for this ever-changing world, this energy transition world that we're passing through? What approach would you recommend for motivate them in their careers?
Okay. And that's a really, really good question, Nancy. It's a question I get from all of my students here in Australia, from a lot of young professionals. And look, the main thing is to understand the subsurface. Continue everything you do to get the most understanding of the subsurface. Do reservoir characterization, do all of those things that will come into play for whether you're injecting CO2, producing methane, producing oil, or for that matter, producing water from a water well, disposing of water in water disposal situations, working for oil and gas companies, doing methane storage, doing hydrogen storage, all of these things. We have a very, very important niche. We are the stewards of the subsurface, okay? We will have very little influence, unfortunately, on the regulatory fronts. We will have very little influence on the liability issues, policy, unless we get to a point where we're senior enough so that they start listening to us. So the best thing is just to hone your subsurface skills to the best of your abilities. That's the technical stuff. In terms of how you cope with the ever-changing, flexibility, okay? If you can't get a job producing oil and gas, start looking around for the CCS opportunities. If you can't do CCS, start looking at hydrogen. Just keep yourself flexible and keep yourself up to date with the technologies. How do you keep yourself up to date with the technologies? Well, obviously, you read the journals, but probably most important, do exactly what we're doing today. Get engaged with your professional societies. Get engaged with people like myself, but probably smarter people around. See what they're doing. See what they're talking about. Communicate your questions regularly. Find out what is going on in the world. Network. And the AAPG, the SPE, your local student chapters, are the best way to do that, to keep in touch with what's going on. So you guys are doing all the right stuff. And I really, really am proud of you all and very, very pleased to have spent the last hour and a half with you. So thank you for allowing me this, and thank you for your questions. And I hope that last one, Nuncio, covered what you needed from me.
Yes, yes. The pleasure is ours, and very wise words. Thank you very much. Thank you again, Professor Kaldi. It was an incredible talk, an incredible experience. We would like to thank the AAPG that allows these enrichment spaces, and of course the University of Buenos Aires that gives us this space to learn and keep increasing our knowledge in all these important matters in the energy transition world. And I hope to see you soon.
Yeah, I hope so too, and I hope it could be face to face in some time.
Hopefully. And now in
Okay.
Spanish, muchas gracias a todos por haber atendido. Les recomendamos que nos sigan en las redes sociales, en Instagram, en LinkedIn, y estén atentos a las próximas charlas que van a seguir viniendo. Muchas gracias por todos y nos vemos.
Muchas gracias a todo.